Hey Michael, so good to be here and chatting with you about batteries. Both of our favorite topics and both something that we've been talking about for a long time, many years over our careers. So yeah, happy to have this public conversation. Just give a quick recap on things that are happening in the last 12, 15, 18 months. And yeah, it's our first time talking together publicly. So I'd love to learn more about what you do, what your focus is, and who you are just before we get kicked off, and also just to learn more about the Volta Foundation and the slides that we're going to go over today.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks for inviting me. So my name is Michael, and I am the Director of Research and Insights at Volta Foundation. We are the world's largest network of battery professionals. And as a global not-for-profit association, we represent more than 50,000 battery professionals in over 200 member companies. Our organization itself produces many different things, such as publications like the Battery Report, which we'll talk a little about today, Battery Bits, Battery Forum, which are networking opportunities and events, and things like Women in Batteries. So we cover quite the spectrum of content in battery space, and it's really exciting to be here today with Voltaiq and with you, Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And if you have not heard of this Volta Foundation report before, you should check it out here. You can click the or go to the QR link, and you'll have 500 slides just summarizing everything that happens every single year for the last few years. And it's just a really good way to stay up to date, whether you're new to the battery industry or not new to the battery industry. There's just so much going on, which is why it really justifies these huge reports to get you up to date.
Yeah, most
Um,
definitely. This one's quite large
yeah,
this year, so it's great to be
yeah,
going over the highlights today.
yeah, exactly. Just going over our favorite, 10, 12 slides that we think are really impactful and really tell the story of the whole industry. I just wanted to dive a bit more into this with you and just have an open conversation about what's going on. So I'll get kicked off in the slides. I really like these, 2024 summary slides of just everything that happened. It just paints all in one picture. But the one thing that really jumps out to me in these are the number of Chinese logos. There's a lot of things happening in China. China is just coming at the battery industry and EV industry in full force. BYD here launched their $15,000 electric vehicle with a 48 kilowatt hour battery pack. Cell costs reached less than $50 per kilowatt hour, a lot in China, and a lot of fundamental chemistry work as well, continuing to work on solid state batteries. Actually, BYD announced their commercialization of solid state batteries early 2025 as well, early this year in quarter one. So um, already a lot of progress there. BYD also working on sodium ion, and a lot of new cell models and cell designs showing up with CATL, BYD, EVE, um, both in the battery industry, EV industry, and related industries as well. I was in Singapore recently, and I saw BYD also had a restaurant chain, which is new
Really?
news to me. So
Wow.
really just like taking over a lot of different things as well. Yeah, quite a lot of things happening in the Western world too. Pretty big financing rounds, debt raises from the likes of Northvolt, Vercor, ACC, and um, yeah, just a lot going on. Wondering what your take is here, Michael.
Yeah, I think the theme of this past year has really been about a correction in the market. In 2022, we had a large forecast of demand on consumption side, and the supply chain stepped up to try to meet that demand, even though they were projected to fall a little bit short. In 2024, the story has reversed. We now are looking at an overcapacity environment with weaker demand than expected. And so we're seeing some of the fallout due to that. Things like China changing the rules in order to slow down the amount of overcapacity that they have by focusing on quality, and for the rest of the world, really focusing on localizing their supply chain.
Yeah, there's a lot of geopolitics in play as well, with what you just said, and we'll dive more into that in some of the coming slides. Uh, And just moving forward to the next half of 2024, the big thing for me, and I'm sure a lot of other people, was the downfall of the Fold, which was the darling of Europe in the battery world, alongside several growth rounds in Western companies. Volkswagen with Rivian, Sila, Forum. These are large multi-hundred million plus rounds. But also seeing that and coming to an understanding that a lot of this is very difficult to do alone. And so the Volkswagen Rivian partnership is one part of many other partnerships that are coming around. And so what was interesting to me was Stellantis working with CATL, and we actually have a whole slide dedicated to all the other partnerships happening. Just a realization now that it's hard to do things alone, and companies can go much further when they work with others and form these partnerships in order to leverage different company strengths.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we're really seeing in the investment space, which we'll talk about in the next slide, is that priorities are shifting more towards production capacity and supply chain resilience. We're seeing some of the larger investments in the US space for Volkswagen, Sila, and Form Energy. These are really focused on deployment of their technology and scale up, not necessarily looking at new bets. Of course, there are more of those early stage, early TRL investments that occur this year, but really the majority of the focus has been on deployments of technologies.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And focusing in on those investments and deployments, one thing that I like to keep a pulse on is the venture capital landscape and funding landscape in the broader sense as well. When I started working in the industry in the mid 2010s, there was not too much going on, and then everything sort of jumped up from 2020 onwards, post Tesla Battery Day, where they made the famous 4680 tablets announcement. And ever since then, there's been huge rounds of investments, a lot of funding, a lot of number of rounds. But then, yeah, it really tailed off. And just looking at this graph here on the top right, it seems like things are coming back to where they were back in 2019, 2020. But I'd say the one observation here is if you look at the bottom plot on the right-hand side, the number of large mega rounds, number of 100 million plus rounds are actually still not very big, even though the amount of funding is climbing back up slowly. So yeah, slowly climbing back up, but overall still quite low compared to where we used to be in the last few years.
Yeah, the one big thing that we've seen in the industry this past year, is that the largest funds that are raised have not been for battery, but for more automotive in general, and also for raw materials. The three largest dilutive capital raises in 2024 were for NIO, was about 2.2 billion in January. IM Motors, which is about 1.1 in March, and then Cobalt Metals, which was 491 million in October. Whereas in the battery space, I think we've talked about it previously, the two big ones were Form Energy at 405 million in October, and also Sila at 375 million in June.
Yeah. A lot of those mining rounds that you're talking about, or mining in raw materials and raw chemicals, a lot of that goes to show that the US is actively trying to, or not the US, but the Western world in general is trying to focus on supply chain independence, American independence. And a lot of these raw materials currently come from places outside the Western world. And so it's always a question of, okay, if we can bring cell manufacturing to the US, are there other parts of the battery value chain that we can bring to the US as well? And that's always that's always been the goal for a lot of these things. That's why we're seeing more excitement from these fields as well.
Most definitely. I think in the past, especially earlier on in the development of EVs and batteries, global policy focused on globalization and making sure that the bottom line cost was the lowest across the supply chain. Now we have different values being pushed forward in terms of what is the most important in terms of establishing the supply chain, and resilience is starting to become quite important for the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm. Because if we don't have that resilience, essentially then the Western world is at the mercy of any supply chain disruptions and things like overcapacity coming in from different countries. And that's exactly what we've been seeing for the last 2+ years. There's been tremendous overcapacity of the entire value chain, raw materials, upstream raw materials, all the way down to any intermediates, and then down to cell manufacturing in China. So this has been quite problematic for the rest of the world, as they find it basically impossible to compete with a lot of this oversupply, which results in extremely, extremely low prices. And so I think this also is one symptom of the fundraising down round compared to the last few years, just because it's hard to invest when things are currently so cheap just to buy them abroad.
Yeah, the overcapacity is one of the most talked about trends that we've seen in this past year, and I think it's quite important to wrap our heads around. And again, it's been this mismatch of forecasted demand in 2022 versus the realized demand today. And although consumption has increased year over year compared to back in 2022, we're seeing that the growth has undershot predicted levels. And China's a really great case study for this. You can see in the graphs on the left provided by Crew, the capacity ratio between the end-use demand and the capacity is almost 2x throughout the value chain: battery cells, active materials, lithium chemicals. We do have overcapacity in the industry, but some of the underlying mechanisms potentially make it less worrisome. For one, plants, their nameplate capacity, we're only operating about 70% at the start of production. And we do need some margin in order to accommodate the anticipated annual production growth of about 30-40%. So it's not as dire as it seems, but it is quite a serious overcapacity scenario that we're seeing today.
And one of the big symptoms of overcapacity is battery prices. And we can't get away with a battery talk without showing this iconic graph from Bloomberg. And they've been doing this every year since 2013, where they get a survey of all the battery cells and pack prices around the world and create a weighted average. And so here, global cell prices, $78 per kilowatt hour. Once you think about it in a pack sense, it's around $115 per kilowatt hour. So it's the lowest it's ever been. A lot of this is driven by China. And you'll notice a small bump in 2022 as well. And this is where we had a large cycle of shortages in raw materials, or supposed shortage in raw materials, particularly lithium, where prices went up to around $90,000 per ton. So a lot of this is falling now. And then if you only look at China, for example, cell prices are down to $40 to $45 per kilowatt hour, and it's falling extremely rapidly. And a lot of this is quite mind-boggling. I still remember prices back when I was undergrad, and so this was in the $500 to $1,000 per cell per kilowatt hour, and it's just it's come a very long way.
It's come an incredibly long way, and there's not to say that this chart belies some of the struggles that we're seeing in the industry. It's an incredibly tough downward price pressure that requires new market entrants to maintain a high throughput and those scrap rates to remain competitive in this sort of cost. I think you mentioned 45. I remember seeing $56 per kilowatt hour for LFP. It's quite low compared to the historic average for spot prices. And this price pressure is really squeezing the margins. You recall that Bloomberg NEF estimates is about a 10% margin between calculated cost and spot prices for LFP this year, which is far away from the peak of close to 35% back in 2022, when we had that lithium supply chain squeeze. So it's quite a different environment from 2 years ago.
Yeah, so for Michael, for a new entrant who's coming into the battery space and they're saying we've got a new chemistry and it's gonna do, it's gonna have improved performance with energy density or fast charging and or something like that. Um, how do you feel when they're comparing against numbers like this?
It's quite difficult to compete with just the raw pricing power of LFP. Cost has become a very sensitive factor for technology adoption. Um, Previously, we were looking at high value equals high performance, but currently high value means the most cost effective. And so there is a stronger focus on unit economics in what's being funded and what's being moved forward in industry.
Yeah, focusing on what's manufacturable because that's one way to really drive the cost down.
Most definitely, yeah.
Okay. Um, okay, so we've spoken a lot about China in the last half an hour, and now as a response, a lot of Western countries and other countries outside China as well are looking to diversify and protect themselves with trade policy. So in the US, we're seeing a lot of tariffs now, for example, or bans on certain Chinese goods, which is an attempt to boost domestic production, certain raw materials, even though this might be quite difficult to overall save in costs and emissions. And overseas supply chains can be very, very complex as well and very opaque. So that's why we're seeing a lot more of this um, geopolitics rising and different ways to localize production supply chains.
Yeah, most definitely. There's a slide in the battery report that was showing where the distribution of raw materials processing and final production were. And the majority of it, of course, is done in China. This is especially apparent in the anode materials and natural graphite reserves, as the majority of the raw materials and processing is done in China, which poses a large resilience issue and challenge for the EU and US. And so we're seeing a lot of legislation and a lot of discussion around how to establish more diverse sources in the supply chain for graphite. Maybe not for natural, but for artificial especially.
Yeah. And, I look at China and actually I applaud them for recognizing the materials that they have, the capabilities that they have, and really investing many,
Yeah,
many,
most
2 decades ago and really spending a lot of time and effort to develop their own local supply chains because it's put them in a leading spot right now. And so when you compare, cell or even I guess this on the left is mostly focused on cell production, but if you look at any production, high yield production is always extremely challenging, and this is something that China has had 20 plus years head start on anything related to batteries. And so when we I talk about we as like the US mostly, when we're coming into the picture, we're starting off with a lot of learning to do, and a lot of learning results in extremely high scrap rates in the first few years of operation. And I like this plot because it's very shocking to me that this is the baseline and normal that we were just going with. And so year one, you're looking at 25 to 30% scrap rates. This is tens and hundreds of millions of dollars if you're a gigawatt hour scale factory, and essentially throwing away one out of every three cells that you make. All of these, we've talked about all these global supply chains, bringing the nickel, the cobalt, the lithium, the phosphate, all of these things from different countries and bringing it all into one place. All the labor that's gone into making these batteries with extremely high precision equipment, only to throw it away at the end is wild to me. And so
most definitely.
Everything that we can do to learn faster, to get these scrap rates down over a shorter amount of time rather than 5 years and 4 years to get to profitability. And so that we can the cost of scrap on the right hand side is extremely expensive. So anything that we can do to reduce time to market and reduce scrap on a daily basis is key to mastering this operational excellence and being competitive on the global scale.
Yeah, I think you hit one of the key points very clearly and just now. Uh, the scrap rates in gigafactories are quite large in the first couple of years. We think about maybe like a 10 billion opportunity for a 25% scrap rate at 1.5 terawatt hours. And the further down you catch the defect in your line, the more value you're adding to that now um, yield loss material. And so detecting your defects early and earlier stage in your manufacturing process is really going to save a higher amount of money. And the only way to really understand why we're seeing these yield losses is to conduct root cause analysis and then systematically improve the process that way. And the only way to do root cause analysis is through inspection.
Yeah, love that. And that really ties in nicely to the next slide. And I'll start off with this slide just talking about a quick analogy that our friend Adrian Yao always likes to talk about. We're just battery making is like sandwich making, and it's true. And when we're talking about scrap and defects and anything of that sense, if you take me and Michael, for example, and we were to make two sandwiches side by side, we're gonna put different amounts of mayo and mustard. Our ham sizes are gonna be cut differently. The bread might be different if like one piece is on the end side and one's in the center side. So even with sandwich making, you can start to think about how much variation and variability there is between every single person who's making a sandwich. And now you multiply that by 1 million sandwiches per day. It's going to be how can you look at all the data and all the defects and all the variability within seconds and find out where you're going wrong and why. And that's also why I'm very, very passionate about data and software, because we can make all the batteries in the world, but if we're not looking at the data correctly and looking at that upstream traceability and digital traceability, where we're having a whole thread of materials, processes, and test data from one end to the other, then we're not going to efficiently realize when there is a problem and why there is a problem and how to fix that problem. And that's the root cause of scrap and low ramp rate factories.
Yeah, most definitely. I think our industry is infamously slow at technology adoption for manufacturing and modernization of data analysis. I hate to admit it, but a lot of the work in the industry is done in Excel sheets, which is really not the state of the art way to be looking at mass production data that way. And so, one, improving the MES systems, and two, improving the infrastructure around how we look at data and understand data is going to be critical to scaling and meeting the demands of the end use industries that we have for batteries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why I'm so passionate about Voltaiq, looking at electrochemical data and any kind of production battery data holistically. And I will also say that even though there are ways to look at data from different cell characterization methods right now, there's always better ways to do something. And so that's why I'm also very interested and passionate about other techniques. They might not necessarily be brand new techniques, but they are a much more efficient way to do a certain thing. So looking at things like ultrasound or CT X-ray scanning, or different tools to do electrode scanning for electrode characterization. My take is that, the more data, the better. The more improved characterization techniques, the better. Because science is always improving, technology is always improving. And so to make sure that you are having a factory of the future, it's important to always stay up to date with all these new techniques as well.
Most definitely.
And yeah, going back to cell production partnerships, not doing everything by yourself is important, and that's one of the big lessons as well from the Northvolt story. So I like to see more collaboration. So everything here you can see cell maker to car maker collaborations, Panasonic, Subaru, LG Rivian, LG Renault, Samsung, GM, Stellantis with Zeta, Stellantis with CATL as well, like we mentioned earlier. It's also quite interesting that Stellantis is partnering with Zeta and Tiamat, so just looking at a lot of different cell chemistries and early stage R&D as well. And another interesting one that happened a couple of weeks ago, 2025 rather than 2024, but there was a new patent partnership between LG and Panasonic working on a program called Tulip Innovations, which is a joint patent licensing program.
Interesting.
So it's, battery manufacturers now are looking for efficient and flexible ways to access rights under a broad patent portfolio of other companies. And so very interesting because these companies are historically extremely secretive. And so to be able to now share their patents broadly like this and then allow for external licensing is different, but also a recognition that some things can be shared.
Do also want to point out something quite interesting here too. In the case of LGES and GM, we're seeing that the partnership exceeds for example, technology strategy that is currently existing in these two companies. And what I mean by this, LG is primarily doing cylindrical cells and pouch cells in their production. However, in GM's technology roadmap, they're looking to produce more prismatic cells, especially in their cost-effective cars and economy cars, which LGES does not have the supply chain and the production setup. But because of this partnership, they are going to develop that program within LGS itself. So it's interesting to see that the partnership supersedes the strategic partnership and current technology.
Yeah, you touched on cell formats, and I think over time with these increasing amounts of both partnerships, but also mergers or acquisitions or consolidation of companies, but also consolidation of types of applications, we're ultimately going to see a narrowing of some of the cell formats that you just touched on. So I wanted to get your take on, what's gonna win out in terms of the chemistries and form factors over time, and why.
Yeah, definitely. This is a topic that I'm super interested in. In the late 2010s, there existed this uncertainty to what form factor would dominate the EV industry. We were seeing about equal contributions of all cylindrical, pouch, and prismatic. Now in 2024, we have a clear winner, and that's prismatic. It's interesting how chemistry and form factor interact. One influences the other and vice versa. And today we're seeing this bifurcation in the preferred formats for different chemistries. LFP is squarely partnered with prismatic, whereas higher energy density chemistries such as NCM and high nickel chemistries are also taking part in cylindrical and pouch. And LFP dominates the prismatic and is almost solely in the prismatic space because that form factor allows for the highest packing efficiency on the pack level, which is required if LFP wants to be competitive to the higher chemistry, energy density chemistries on the pack level. LFP allows this sort of higher packing factor because it has a better safety profile compared to NCM chemistries. And so pack designers with high quality cells are able to then increase the amount of cell inside a pack and reduce the amount of spacing between them.
Yeah. You also mentioned something in our prep call last time about prismatic versus cylindrical in terms of safety in vehicles and how they sort of erupted when they were accidents. I thought that was really interesting. I just wanted to bring that back and make some comments on that.
One of the reasons why we're seeing a bifurcation in LFP versus the NCM form factors is that when you experience thermal runaway, how the cell fails matters just as much as if it will fail in in the first place. For these high energy density chemistries where you're increasing the amount of total energy in the system in the small amount of space, having this thermal runaway propagation resistance of preventing subsequent cells adjacent to the failed cell is paramount in ensuring a system level safety. And so for high energy density chemistries, cylindrical cells are an attractive form factor because if designed right, the failure mode and direction of the energy released is within the axial direction of the cell as opposed to isometrically.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting visual to think about. And then one last thing on the slide, but are we really not seeing any LFP form factors of other form factors?
LFP is not as popular in other form factors just because you take a large penalty on the pack level. For cylindrical, for example, there's a lot of dead space just due to the geometry. And for pouch, there's just a lot more padding that's required within the pack space in order to safely put these cells together. And so with LFP especially, in increasing your packing efficiency and the structural nature of those prismatic cells, you're then able to incorporate the cell to pack, cell to module, cell to chassis architecture that takes advantage of the inherent safety profile.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Moving on to battery energy storage systems, BESS. The news talking about the EV market moving slowly, slow sales and just slowing down market in general. I think we were both at the launch event for this report a couple of weeks ago, and Vineet at Tesla was giving a talk about this, and it's also really interesting. This isn't actually the case. Actually, many people were extremely excited and overzealous before, and it's ramped down certainly from those extremely high expectations, and as a result, you're getting some cutback from EV and cell suppliers. But still, overall, the global gradient is still positive. There is still positive growth, and what's even more interesting is the BESS industry. Global BESS deployments reached 69 gigawatt hours in 2024. This was a 55% increase from 2023. It's growing extremely rapidly. The Economist called it the grid scale technology, the fastest growing energy technology in 2024. So growing very fast, and a lot of it is growing on from the shoulders of the electric vehicle market. So much more to look out for in the BESS industry in the coming years.
Most definitely. And Nick, you touched on the increase in power over 2023. I also want to touch on some statistics for the market size itself. The 2024 BESS market grew 20% year over year to 90 billion in 2024. And the utility scale market contains about 85% of this growth. But remaining is commercial and industrial. And one of the reasons why we're seeing such a large increase in the market growth is due to costs. The BESS market rides the cost curve down with the BEV adoption. And one of the key examples that highlights why cost is a strong factor, there was a bid in China last year, I think in December, that had an average cost of $66 per kilowatt hour for battery enclosures plus PCS, which is quite impressive of how low it can go in spot prices. So the adoption's definitely been driven by the cost pressures down.
Yeah, did you say $66 per kilowatt hour?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Yeah, that's like almost half of what we showed in the Bloomberg report, actually. So there is a really big difference between like Chinese prices and global weighted average prices, and that's one to always keep in mind when you look at reports online. But that's a really good data point. All right, I think this is our last slide, but just talking about chemistry a bit more. What's your take on LMFP?
There's a large push to increase the volumetric energy density of LFMFP, or LFP in general. The two ways that are being pushed forward currently is to introduce manganese into the chemistry, which increases the average discharge voltage of the cell. And the second one is to increase the packing density of LFP. The press density of LFP is currently one of the most highest leverage opportunities to increase the volumetric energy density. And that's being seen in terms of the research output and also patents. This slide is quite interesting from our academia team because it shows the trends of patents and research and how they're intertwined with one another. Back in the 2000s and 2010s, the majority of the patents that are filed in the industry on a ratio between LFP and NMC were by and large 4 out of 5 NMC. And we also saw this with the publication space. However, back in the mid-2010s, this changed, and LFP started increasing in interest in the private sector. Up to almost about half of the patents filed were for LFP versus NMC. The academic space caught wind of this, and they started also increasing the amount of research that was conducted in the university and academic space. Now we're seeing almost at its peak about 70% of the research publications that were output focus on LFP.
Yeah, I think what my one question on this or comment is that when we talk to cell level chemistry people, a lot of the talk is, what's more effective? Is it small stepwise incremental improvements, or is it large step change moonshot chemistries, game-changing chemistries that will leapfrog different technologies from what we currently have to something that will just blow everything out the water? And so I think those are two of the main approaches that people are always thinking about. Is it fair to say that LMFP is a small incremental improvement? Is it as simple as you just talked about, just adding a little bit of manganese into the precursors to make your LFP? And does that kind of show is this showing adoption of the first step, which is the slow incremental improvements, or is this a major step change in chemistry?
Yeah. Just wanted to be known that introducing manganese into LFP is not an easy feat. It's something that we've been trying to do for quite some time. Manganese dissolution into electrolyte and poisoning the anode is one of the key failure modes in this new chemistry. And a lot of companies have devised clever ways to engineer their materials and also cells to try to prevent this issue. I would view this more as an incremental increase in the energy density and performance of the cell, as it's a small increase in the average discharge voltage. However, we do have to remember that these sort of changes are important because they compound on one another. So for example, if the energy density of chemistry increased by a certain percentage and the innovations on the cell level that allow for a larger amount of active material into a single cell also improve, those are compound efforts. And so even though they're incremental on their own rights, focusing on things that will improve on a compound measure is the most effective way.
Yeah, we're both chemistry people, so we know how hard these seemingly easy small incremental improvements are. It's to the untrained eye, maybe it's just adding like a letter to the LFP. It's just LMFP. It's relatively simple. I think that's also one misconception with silicon. People or companies are working on silicon, and getting from a few percent silicon, just adding incrementally 1% to the anode overall formulation. That's one of the things that are, I think, commonly misunderstood as well.
Yeah, most definitely.
Okay, so that's kind of the slides that we thought were very, very impactful, and just a preview of some of the rest of the slides from the Volta Foundation 2024 report. There's a lot more, so go check that out. But just to wrap everything up, I know we're one quarter through 2025, but what are you looking forward to most, or what are you most excited to for the rest of the year?
I'm most excited about the new inspection methods that are coming onto the industry this year. One particular one that I'm most excited about is a small startup called Glimpse. They are a CT-based startup that they are promising statistical analysis of CT metrics such as jelly roll width, core collapse, things like that, which is pretty unprecedented in our space. Those who are familiar with the industry know that CT can take quite a long time for even one scan. And to be able to have statistical control on those sort of metrics would be huge. So that's something I'm really looking forward to. They also actually just raised their Series A with TDAK Ventures as their lead investor. So it's quite exciting.
Awesome. Congrats to Glimpse. From my side, I'm very excited about, or if I were to have a word of the year, it'd probably be just change. I think that this year is very, very critical for any company in the battery space. And so if something's not working for you right now, look for alternatives. Look actively and proactively look for ways to improve. One example that always comes to mind is Energy Vault. So if you remember back in the day of the SPACs, they SPACed as a company that lifts and puts concrete bricks down to get that gravitational energy, and that was the main pitch. And now, actually, if you look at their quarterly earnings, they are doing LFP. They're making LFP best packs, and so
look at that.
Something wasn't working. They changed it, and now they're back in LFP. And so, I encourage companies to just think about every process and think about the slides that we talked about and how things can be done better. And that's what I'm excited about.
That's awesome. That's good to hear that they're pivoting. Although I was very excited for the granite blocks. So it'd be pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. I think they're doing both. So it's one to look at. Cool. Where can people find you, Michael?
I'm most active on LinkedIn. Please feel free to follow me there. Just look up Michael Liu from Volta Foundation and you'll be able to find me.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks for your time.
Of course. Thanks, Nick.